Good evening, everyone. This is Heather Van Wild with Raindrop Works. Um, been a while since I've done one of these. Obviously, I'm not the biggest fan of having my face in front of the camera, but sometimes I think it's worth it. Um, Tonight I'm doing a reading of a letter that was written up by a former employee of the Portland Police Bureau who is fairly active on leftist Twitter. And reading it, when I first read it, it hit hard at just how messed up the situation is, honestly. Obviously, a lot of people have been pushing for police accountability and fighting against racism. And the idea that our sworn police officers, the ones with the badges, are doing this is bad enough. But it's more than just them. It really is a systemic issue that goes up and down the tree, and there are more bad apples than I ever really would have considered. As I've been prefacing online and in the video description here, a forewarned content warnings for references to a lot of instances of ableist language, racism, transgender discrimination, homophobia, nationalist views, things that if my channel was monetized, I would fully expect the video would be demonetized, if not a community standard strike. But this is in the interest of journalism, and I honestly feel like it's worthwhile to go through this anyway. That said, I need a drink to get through this. RevNet helped set me up last month on Transgender Day of Remembrance with some of their cider, and I haven't gotten to try a whole lot of it yet, so tonight I'm cracking open the Saint Citron, and hopefully it will help get through some of what's going on here. So without further ado, the letter opens up. Dear Jen, these are my experiences working in records from January 2016 until June 2020. Some of these details come from my journal, while others come from memory. As time went on, I wrote fewer and fewer specifics into my journal because it seemed pointless and was incredibly depressing. So exact dates and quotes are more likely the earlier in my time in records the incident occurred. I have also tried to be illustrative instead of comprehensive. A few incidents are not my personal experience, but events that were relayed to me by colleagues whose opinions and word I trust. I will not name them as they were told to me in confidence, but I feel that it is important that they also be recorded here. You and others may look at how long this is and what I describe and wonder if it seems incongruous with my behavior prior to June 5th. Ma'am, professionalism and good customer service is all about acting like nothing is bothering you. Composure is not the same thing as ease. I did not come forward earlier for several reasons. As I stated in my email, I felt silenced from day one, which I will explain below. Additionally, I worried that my concerns would be dismissed as the complaints of a liberal snowflake, as I knew I was in the minority politically in this office. There were definitely days when I felt like I was surrounded by all 17% of Portland who had voted for Donald Trump. I knew when I took the job that law enforcement tended to skew extremely conservative, but I had hoped that this being Portland and this particular division being non-sworn, that it would be more representative of the city and its very liberal image. I was very wrong. Another issue was the fact that the changing work schedule kept me off balance. To other people, it probably seemed like I was on any given shift long enough to have been just fine, but For me, changing shifts was very disruptive socially and to my health, which took priority over dealing with problems at work, even if those problems caused additional stress. Nice. Another reason was trust. Like most people, I find it difficult to trust people I do not feel comfortable around. In order to come forward with concerns, I had to be able to trust that the person I spoke with would take me seriously and be sympathetic. I did not feel comfortable being myself or speaking my mind, even in couch terms, most of the time in records, and certainly not around most of the training coordinators. I came exceptionally close to trusting Stu Pelham after assistance with some issues, including one I will describe below. But then the pandemic hit, and her schedule and mine no longer overlapped. Had the pandemic not hit and the protests not followed, this would have all turned out very differently indeed. Yet another was that I kept waiting for change, and while I waited, it seemed like it was too late to report the problems that I had witnessed. I didn't want to judge all of records on my first bad impression, so I hoped that things would improve if I just stuck around with it a little while longer, or moved to a different shift. Then Wendy Steinbraun came, or promised change and improvement. I waited and it never came. Then you promised change and improvement. I waited and it never came. Meanwhile, I sat through all that I described below and more, and the training coordinators and shift supervisors never seemed to notice, even when it was right in front of them. Sometimes they were part of the problem. Finally, I truly did fear retaliation. I know that there are policies against retaliation, but that does not mean that it does not happen. Some of the things I've heard people say are so egregious, in my opinion, that I truly did worry about what might happen if the person who said it knew that I reported it, especially if it led to some kind of disciplinary action. I had to work with these people. I desperately wanted to stand up and do what was right, but I was stymied by anxiety and fear, which was then amplified by the shame that I felt by not speaking up. When I would share examples with my family of things that I witnessed, they would say that it seemed like a hopeless situation, and they would counsel me to just keep my head down, do a good job, get a good reference, and move on. In general, that was my plan from the beginning, since, as I told you at our meeting, this was not a job that I had really ever planned on having or planned on keeping long term. When I started working records in January of 2017, I was assigned to night shift with Mel as my training coordinator. On my first night, the subject of the workplace harassment seminar came up, and she told me that it was a bunch of BS about what we're not allowed to say anymore, in a very dismissive tone of voice. If I had had any other options or had been a stronger person, I would have quit on the spot. However, I'd already exhausted myself getting to this point. I'd applied to so many jobs, I'd bothered so many people to get the required number of references, and I was off balance being new to living on night shift, as I had never done that for any other job. To this day, I am outraged when I think about how that attitude forms the culture that too many people embrace in records. I didn't know who to report the comment to, as it was my first day, and I would not attend the harassment seminar for a few months because apparently it was considered a very low priority. If I remember correctly, I had to bother Tammy Weiss about finally getting it on my calendar instead of it being automatically part of my onboarding process. This was the incident that made me feel silenced from day one. If basic information about not being terrible to coworkers is a bunch of BS, then how can people feel safe telling you about problems? How can they trust other members of management or supervisory staff in order to tell them about a problem with you? The fact that my boss was telling me this in the 21st century shocked and stunned me into silence and confusion. For a long time, I had almost no contact with anyone but Mel, who was teaching me A&E. It was not a pleasant experience for a variety of reasons. Her attitudes towards other humans was their primary problem. For example, Mel told me that everyone lies, not sometimes people lie about their names, or sometimes officers write people's names down wrong, but everyone lies. On my second day of work, when a coworker asked her something regarding a caller they had on hold who had already called once before, Mel said, "Why doesn't this Jew understand?" She also told me that if someone had a Spanish-sounding surname, I should automatically mark them as Hispanic. There are so many reasons why someone could have a Spanish-sounding name and not be Hispanic. Mel also plays music at her desk, and I don't have a problem with that in general. However, her choice in music was a constant source of distraction, annoyance, and offense. She has several country western songs that she likes to play on a loop, one of which has a very distinctive and loud "I found Jesus" in the chorus and another "Hallelujah." If I wanted to go to church, I would do so. She'd leave it playing while she was at lunch or working elsewhere as well. Sometimes I was able to drown out the worst of it with my own MP3 player and headphones, once I knew enough A&E to work on my own. But it was never quite enough, and she never struck me as the kind of person who would take kindly to requests to change the music or turn it down. Mel is very friendly with Marty Meyer and Roxy, who have been on night shift for a very long time. On February 14th, 2017, I wrote in my journal, Mel made fun of an Asian, I think, name in a record, and the person she was talking to, Roxy, really not sure, replied with a joke about, how do they come up with those names? They throw the baby across the room and whatever noise they make on this name? Sometimes they made a ching-chong comment. How do people get through the anti-harassment seminars and still think this is okay? At this point, I was still not familiar enough with my co-workers to know who was who, despite being there for 2 weeks already, but I'm fairly certain that one was Roxy and one was Marty. I had not yet attended the harassment seminar, but being a reasonable person in the 21st century, I had some idea that this could not be considered acceptable behavior. To this day, I cannot understand why someone would think this is appropriate in any context, let alone at work, and that joke in particular is especially egregious. But they seem to think it was great. On another occasion, Mel told them some long tale about being annoyed at a transgender person she encountered and used it to describe the person the entire time. This dehumanizing language and commentary towards the LGBTQIA+ community is unfortunately very common, as it appears that Records is stuck somewhere in around 1960. I overheard Roxy talk on a number of occasions about a member of her own family who is transgender, but Roxy could not make up her mind about which pronouns to use, nor could she think to use they, which is acceptable non-gendered singular pronoun. You would think that a member of your family would be enough of an impetus to educate yourself. She even exclaimed surprise at a trans man who, from context, must have been arrested and had a booking photo, having facial hair, which shows considerable ignorance. Even cisgender women can have facial hair. When I graduated from A&E to teletype, I was assigned to Angie. I got on fairly well with Angie, though my experiences with Mel definitely colored every interaction, once bitten, twice shy. There were some occasions when I felt she did not entirely follow what I was saying, which also happened with Patty. This may simply be a difference in communication culture. However, being in the pod meant that I actually started interacting with coworkers for the first time. I tried to set an example by being polite, kind, and friendly. Usually Roxy was tolerable and even friendly, but somehow Marty Meyer took my quiet personality to mean that I was about 5 years old and often treated me as such. It did not help that people frequently underestimate my age by 10 to 15 years at minimum. When coworker 1 told me that Marty was going to train her on intake, I had a moment of panic at the idea that that might be what would happen to me as well, as I knew that it would be a disaster because Marty is one of those people who gets angry if you don't agree with her on every little thing. Marty M. is also one of the people in Records who insists on pushing her very narrow worldview on the rest of us. One time she told me that she hoped the devil would get the person mentioned on the report she was working on. When I looked at her with confusion, she avoided talking to me for the rest of the night. Another time she made fun of someone with the Russian name, and if I mispronounce this, it is not on purpose, Valery, which she mispronounced as the Anglophone feminine name Valerie, talking about how he had a girly name and no wonder he had taken the English nickname of Larry. Having heard her make fun of so many names, and this time having a good explanation, I decided to say something this time. In as innocent a tone as I could muster, I told her that she was pronouncing it wrong, that it was a Russian masculine name, and that the second and third syllables do sound like Larry. So it made perfect sense for him to use that as a nickname. The best explanation I can give for the look on her face is that I had killed her favorite pet. In addition to making fun of people's names, there was also frequent mocking of appearance by sharing booking photos. It seemed almost like a contest to see who could come up with the most, in their opinions, hilarious or ridicule-worthy photos, and then gossip about them. Mel, Roxy, and Marty were all active participants. Some days they spent so much time gossiping, ridiculing, and mocking that I was surprised any work got done. They even would gossip about which coworkers they hated, thought were worthless, and so on, sometimes by name and sometimes only by initials or by inferences. This was not entirely unique to night shift, but was the most obvious there. There was also constant dehumanization of arrestees and many people otherwise listed in reports, and this was something I noticed across the 3 shifts. For example, Marty often refers to arrestees as this humanoid instead of this person, which automatically puts that person into a category of not human. Alexis Castellane is partial to the bad guy, which automatically assumes guilt. Jason Womack talked about delicious schadenfreude at the people who distrust the police having to call the police for any reason, which shows staggering ignorance or an intentional blind eye to the reasons why certain populations may distrust police. I mentioned to you during our meeting how often coworkers would go on and on about how stupid callers to auto records are and how stupid people making online reports were, as if they knew any better before they worked this job. Another person I encountered very early on was Laura Fisher. My first note in my journal that refers to her is from February 12, 2017, and as typical of her behavior, she was complaining about protests. This is a common theme in records. I never heard anything good about people using their First Amendment rights, and I can't remember a single instance when my coworkers seemed properly informed on the issue being protested. On February 12, 2017, Fisher was complaining about the Women's March on Washington and on other cities, memorable for the pink hats with cat ears. She found them to be vulgar and seemed to be completely ignorant of the fact, or willing to completely ignore the fact, that they were a direct response to vulgar words spoken by Donald Trump. On April 3, 2017, she was complaining about another protest and told someone that they should arrest them all and that any teenager at the protest was a result of bad parenting. It got to the point where I would hope she would call in sick if our schedules overlapped when a protest was also known to be planned. More recently, during the COVID-19 quarantine, I had to listen to her ranting about conspiracy theories related to how fluoride in water makes you stupid, something about how vaccines make us all sheep, COVID-19 being a Chinese conspiracy, and how contracts tracing is some Stasi shit. This last is particularly egregious, comparing a standard practice in public medicine with an established history that goes back more than 100 years to the practice of the East German secret police is beyond the pale. Though it also would not stop me if she really meant the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. Either way, the fact that the coordinator on duty did not shut her down on any of these instances and instead let her rant for all to hear was extremely disappointing. Instead, coordinators chose to shut down innocuous, friendly, and team-building conversations about, for example, how adorable our pet cats and dogs are. Fisher is also a good example of the cliquish and juvenile behavior that I witnessed in records. An example of this is when she moved to afternoon shift, and something that I did manage to report to Sue Pelham, as it was something that not only affected me directly, but also impacted the workflow. For this reason, I felt confident that someone would listen to my concerns, and Sue's subsequent actions gave me hope for further progress that unfortunately was derailed by the pandemic. For some reason, Fisher decided that she did not like me and refused to speak to me, even to share necessary information, except on very rare occasions. Meanwhile, she worked with friendly demeanor towards everyone else. After this began causing problems, for example in recovering stolen vehicles, I spoke to Sue to ask for advice. Sue spoke to Fisher and then spoke to me again. Sue reported that Fisher decided that I had been snarky to her on one occasion and she just wasn't going to take it. This is so ludicrous that I almost have no words of response. Based on the description of the event that Sue provided, I believe I know the incident, and the thing I did was look at Fisher with confusion as I explained to Sue. Apparently that is sufficient to justify destroying workflow and communication for weeks. Meanwhile, I've been forced to listen to Fisher rant on a regular basis, gossip extensively for large portions of her overtime, and so on, and yet I was always professional and, when possible, even friendly. Fisher is also an example of the casual racism and lack of empathy that is endemic in records. For example, there was an instance in February 2019 when she told the person relieving her at the intake desk that she was certain a Hispanic woman whose booking they were waiting for was going to lie about their name just because they were Hispanic. She spoke of undocumented immigrants like they were dangerous, feral animals rather than desperate fellow human beings. This winter, I overheard her tell a colleague about her son and his partner visiting for the holidays from out of town. She insisted on taking the young woman around Portland to see all the homeless people. The tone of her voice and the nature of the conversation made it clear that it was not out of concern for the homeless, not because the visitor may have been someone interested in social work who wanted to know more about the situation, but rather because Fisher considered the homeless to be a local attraction like zoo animals. It's difficult for me to convey this because the concept is so foreign to me, but that is how it was said. Additionally, she talked at length on another occasion about bringing a weapon with her onto Max, because the sheer existence of homeless people on public transit made her certain that she was going to be murdered. This is unreasonable. Yes, things do happen, but simply being homeless does not make you a violent criminal out to murder other people. On one occasion, while SLVing a missing person entry, she complained that the missing girl deserved to be picked up as a prostitute and jailed if she wanted to be running around like she did. The missing teenager had developmental disability and had been judged to have a mental age of about 12 years old. Fisher is also the type of person who insists on blaming every person for every decision with an unfortunate outcome. Loud victim blaming when working on rape reports was not uncommon and very disheartening to have to listen to. But she was not the only one to voice these sorts of unconscionable opinions. Sometime in my first 6 months, I had a conversation with Mike Boyard for the first time. I believe he was shift supervisor for nights at the time. I was cautious in my conversation with him, wanting to test the waters, as it were. I referred to juvenile behavior and ignorance, but I felt that he brushed my concerns aside. He said something to the effect of it all being normal office issues and offered strategies he had learned from seminars about combating racism. Strategies, incidentally, that I was already familiar with and had informed my decision to, for example, explain Valeri so innocently to Marty. While I appreciated the offer, I genuinely believe the problems went beyond the sorts of things he suggested. Additionally, I was exhausted from being on night shift. I felt very much isolated on several different levels, and I did not feel that I was working with people who could be swayed by thoughtful conversation. I think he truly meant well, and under other circumstances would have been an excellent ally, but again, I think what I've witnessed goes a bit beyond his common solutions. I needed an authority to back me, to tell my coworkers and boss to be professional and think before they said terrible things. I backed down, squared my shoulders, and hoped things would be better on another shift when I would eventually be moved to one. I was wrong. On day shift, I was trained on auto records by Sherry. I had hoped that I would get along with Sherry, and again, that perhaps I would find someone I could confide in about my concerns. It was a bad fit in terms of personality, but if it were just that, perhaps I would have spoken up. However, it went further than that. For example, on October 5th, 2017, we had a class on some updates to RMS run by Mike Ridnor. I don't know everyone who was present, but Sherry, Deanna, coworker 2, and I were. Coworker 2 was running late, and Sherry and Deanna made some unkind comments about how he must be washing his hands again, how he must have OCD, and so on. It doesn't matter if coworker 2 actually has OCD or not, or if these were meant as jokes or not. These comments were unacceptable, especially coming from coordinators who were essentially floor supervisors. On September 12, 2017, I was sitting at Led's with Sherry beside me, and for some reason that I cannot fathom, she and Leroy began having a long, involved conversation about working at fast food restaurants and what is really in the chili served at Wendy's. I nearly threw up. I had seen that showing any sign of weakness in records was not acceptable, so when Sherry finally asked if I was okay, I lied and said yes. This was also after Lee had exclaimed, "Ding!" every time I handed him something at assist, and Sherry had not told him to cut it out. The first few times should have been enough. Later, when I was on afternoon shift, I discovered there were details of auto records and copy work that Sherry had either neglected to train me to do or had trained me to do incorrectly. I cannot begin to imagine the number of reports that I touched that have had these, albeit small, errors on them. Additionally, Sherry's notes or communications to other coordinators about my training were misleading or very confused. When Patty went to train me at front, Patty thought she was just refreshing my memory when in fact I had never been trained at front at all. On day shift, I ended up working with Joe Felix, Alexis Castellane, Bethany Masters, and Andrew Zell quite a lot in the pod. I tried to be friendly, but they had none of it. It was clear that I was seen as some kind of interloper into their firmly established clique, of which Joe was clearly the leader. I was regularly ignored, my teletype entries not SLV, despite them taking time to chat during lulls between phone calls and other work, and they seemed to have taken their cue from Fisher that anything was appropriate to say at work with no consequences, and that their political views would override work policies. For example, when an email came out saying that we were not to cooperate with requests for information from ICE because Portland is a sanctuary city, Joe and Alexis immediately said out loud for all to hear that they would not comply with this policy because they disagreed with Portland being a sanctuary city. When an email came out saying that a supervisor, Will Russ, had been let go and we were asked not to speculate on the reasons why, the speculations immediately began. Joe Felix, in particular, said that he was certain that some snowflake liberal must have gotten riled up at something Mr. Russ has said because, in his opinion, Mr. Russ was a good guy. There was extensive talk about how anyone who did not support Donald Trump was of questionable intelligence, questionable patriotism, and questionable humanity, which Fisher also expressed on a regular basis. On several occasions, there were discussions about how other cities or states were more patriotic than Portland and how no one was allowed to be patriotic in Portland anymore. In January 2018, Alexis said that she thought that all the people who came forward with allegations during the Me Too movement were just in it for the money and were liars. And when the city announced that they were renaming part of Southwest Stark Street to Southwest Harvey Milk Street in February 2018, she said very confidently that everyone knows he was a pedophile and therefore didn't deserve a street named after him. This was a conspiracy theory that I had never heard regarding Mr. Milk, and I had to Google quite a lot to find it when I got home from work that day, which suggests it's quite the opposite of her assertion. It turned out to be a variation of the old all gay people are pedophiles nonsense, and has been said by one conspiracy theorist once 5 years earlier. I did not record in my journal who that was or which media outlet spread, and have chosen not to Google again for this report. Joe Felix in particular sets off every alarm bell for me. His steadfast sense of entitlement towards becoming a cop is in his every word, and the way he speaks of everyone who disagrees with his views belies the conservative motto of all lives matter. He, more than the others in that clique, refers to Portlanders as scum and trash, the city of Portland as a lost cause, and marginalized communities, especially the mentally ill and the homeless, as subhuman. In September 2017, when the Columbia River Gorge fires were still burning, a protest also occurred in Portland related to some other issue. Joe's idea was to arrest every protester and send them to fight the fires. The idea that the fires were complex and best fought by professionals, that some of the protesters may not have been physically capable of fighting fires due to disability or other issues, or that they may have already contributed time and money to the cause of fighting the fires and were now also protesting, was apparently beyond his imaginative capability. On October 15th, 2017, I wrote in my journal, with the others, Joe was talking about some instances when he was working with the front desk downstairs. How stupid people are. One story ended with a comment about how glorious it would have been if the officers had tased the guy he was complaining about. Also, a lot of complaining about other people in records being terrible. Do I need to explain how disgusting it is to say that it would be glorious for someone to be tased? This and so many other comments tell me that Joe thinks being a law enforcement officer is mostly about shooting people instead of serving the people. On another occasion, when I was on night shift for the second time, I overheard a conversation Joe had with Cindy Joe, who has since moved to another agency. She was training to be a reserve officer with that agency, and they were talking about firearms training. Joe offered her one of his, apparently many, guns to practice with. I don't know if she took him up on it. Cindy Joe lived in Washoe, Washington, and was also frequently severely sleep deprived. We eventually realized that she was only getting a few hours of sleep, if that, and still driving both to work at Records and to the agency she was training with. One morning I was just about to offer her money to get a hotel room to sleep instead of driving home when Sherry stepped in and had a talk with her. In the end, Cindy Joe still somehow drove herself home. Aside from the fact that she was always sleep deprived, and giving a gun to someone who is impaired is not wise. Something about this did not sit right with me. I consulted a family member who's a hunter. He advised me that he believed this was in fact illegal given the state lines issues, and said that there had been something about this in the news a few years ago that he would look up. But unfortunately, he never followed up with a news article or a legal reference that I could quote. Without this solid reference, I did not feel I could report it at that time, especially given Joe's extreme views and the fact that there is nothing to prevent him from bringing a weapon to work since we do not go through metal detectors or get searched on the way in. Paired with Joe's sense of entitlement is his ego, which is propped up by his clique and inexplicably by coordinators who show him favoritism. On several occasions, he talked about how he refused to do A&E because he felt it was beneath him, and that only once he was trained on RecFin was he finally actually using his brain. Joe seems to have become a VIN inspector on the specious claim that the idea of having an in-house VIN inspector was his idea and his alone, which it most certainly was not. It grew organically out of the collective frustrations we were having getting VIN rechecks from the towing companies. One extremely memorable occasion I can think of as the peacocking incident. It was a Sunday when we don't issue hazard releases at the front desk for inexplicable reasons. A young woman wanted to get her car out of impound, but it turned out to be a hazard tow. She convinced Joe that she was sick with cancer and was desperate to get her car back. Joe, in turn, somehow got permission to issue a hazard release, despite it not being the usual procedure, and the young woman came downtown to get it. When Joe returned from downstairs, he regaled us with the tale of how wonderful he was to have bestowed this kindness upon the poor sick girl, and how he really needed to write up an email explaining everything to her shift supervisor. Instead, he strutted around the office like a peacock and interrupted everyone's work one by one to share the story with them as well. It felt like this went on forever. Suddenly, it was about 5 minutes before the end of shift and Joe was back at his desk, bemoaning the fact that he had not written the email, let alone sent it. I don't know if he ever sent an email or spoke to the supervisor in person. I was particularly offended by the incident, not just because of the strutting around and bending the rules, but the fact that he believed the story that she had cancer when he refuses to believe the very real and very likely stories that are otherwise presented to us, which he dismisses as lies. I wasn't at the front desk. Maybe she had paperwork from a hospital, but that proof wouldn't have been seen until she came downtown. I don't know. But like so many in records, he immediately assumes that everyone on the phone is a liar, who is just trying to get something for free, rather than a human being who is struggling like the vast majority of us. Aside from Joe, Felix, and Fisher, another individual whose vehemence and hatred truly frightens me is Jason Womack. Including him in this list would have surprised me greatly when I first met him. We got along fairly well at first. He reminded me of one of my brothers. We had some similar life experiences, having both lived overseas, and we shared similar interests. My first clue that something was not right when he brought up taking his wife, a recent Japanese immigrant, to a museum that featured an exhibit on the internment camps here in the U.S. for Japanese American citizens during World War II. At some point in his story about this trip, he went on a tangent about how people need to just get over it because it was a long time ago, and he used his wife as a kind of prop to support his argument, as though her opinions as a recent Japanese immigrant had some kind of superseding power over the experiences of thousands of Japanese American citizens who lost everything. I was truly surprised at this because as a science fiction fan, and particularly as a Star Trek fan, I expected him to be familiar with George Takei's work in educating the public on exactly why that argument was wrong. Mr. Takei was interned in a camp as a child. As so often was the case, I was caught off guard by this turning conversation and had no response. This kind of erasure is incredibly dangerous and damaging to marginalized communities. Like with some other co-workers, Jason's ego has always been a bit of an issue, but I had chalked it up to some, being typical white male privilege. He's a young white man whose struggles in life have been minor enough to not give him much insight into other people's lives or to force them to reconsider his views. He would repeat unnecessary comments. For example, he would emphasize again and again how much he loves solving mysteries and problems for people who call in, without recognizing that his female co-workers weren't saying things like that. If we hated doing that, this would be a terrible job for us. After he trained at RecFin and Intake, his egotistical and superior attitude seemed worse, but I cannot say for certain if it's the training and a sense of power that went with it was the source, or if there was some other cause. Nonetheless, it was after the comments about the Japanese internment camps that I began noticing that Jason's demeanor towards our work was becoming more extreme. Some of us have this job because it is simply a job. A rare few of us take it on because we truly want to serve the community. And the remainder feel that they are judge, jury, and executioner and seem to get a thrill out of feeling superior to anyone listed on a report for any reason. I was a mix of the first and second, with the second being the reason why I lasted as long as I did. And I initially thought Jason was as well. However, at some point it became clear that he was the third, or he had become the third. I remember one incident in which he was rather grumpy that someone had not been charged for, in my opinion, the very minor act of kicking a tire on a police vehicle. I knew that I would prefer that people kick a tire in anger instead of kicking a person. Other times he complained about all the other charges that officers could have given someone who was already arrested for something, as if being as vindictive as possible would improve the situation. I've already mentioned the delicious schadenfreude comment. Looking back, these sorts of comments and incidents make a clear pattern to me, but at the time, they were strange, isolated events that caught me off guard because I was desperate to believe that he was one of the good apples in records. However, nothing could have prepared me for the truly horrifying comment that came in June 2019. On the day of the protest, when Portland police put out the tweet with the unsubstantiated rumor about cement milkshakes. That tweet has caused so much harm to left-leaning activists and protesters. No retraction could ever have repaired the damage it did. And to my knowledge, no retraction was ever published. No evidence of these cement milkshakes was ever found, and yet Portland police smeared all protesters in a single tweet. On that day, I was working with Jason in the pod, and he saw the tweet before I did. As I recall, I was alone with him, and our third person was away from their desk at the moment. Immediately, he began ranting about it, and took it to be fact. The tweet, in what little defense I can give it based on my memory of it, did not say that officers had witnessed these supposed cement milkshakes, but rather that right-wing protesters had made reports of them. At best, it was a rumor. Jason's anger and vehemence only grew, and at one point he said, "Antifa should be hung in the public square." Given my personal beliefs, no matter that I kept those beliefs quiet at work and he did not know of them, I took this to be a death threat. But I had no one I could report it to who I could trust. On another occasion, Jason talked about how he was going to start buying guns after he managed to adopt some children, because having guns in the house would make him look less desirable to adoption agencies. As a result, I knew that if he truly believed that some people deserved to die for having a political belief he disagreed with, he was also prepared to acquire some means of achieving that. Whether or not he would actually do it, I do not know, or why exactly he wanted to have guns. I also do not know. What I can say is that after that, I never seriously tried to counter anything he said again. I avoided casual conversation with him after that point, and one of the reasons why I finally emailed you in June 2020 to say that I was fine was that one of your emails had mentioned sending an officer out to do a welfare check. The idea of having my home address in RMS for Jason, Joe, Fisher, or anyone else who decided I was now fair game frightened me into finally responding. Jason already had a good idea of where I lived because we took the same bus. I did not need him to know the exact address and unit number. Even if any of my coworkers did not take action directly against me, I knew that, for example, Jason is a fan of Andy No, a right-wing propagandist known for working with the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer gangs, and also for doxing left-leaning activists and protesters. People have been harmed because Mr. No forwarded their information to neo-fascists and white supremacist thugs. I do not want to be one of them. Jason claims Mr. No is a journalist. However, a quick Google search will show that Mr. No breaks every rule of journalistic integrity and is a fraud, a hack, and a grifter. Another very problematic occasion involved Jason talking about the firing and rehiring of the Portland police officer who was found to be erecting memorials to Nazi soldiers. Had Jason only said that it was simply a matter of the police contract requiring the rehirings, which is reprehensible but out of our control, that would have been one thing. However, Jason's argument went further, that it was something done outside of work, that it was a matter of free speech, and of course it wouldn't affect his work. This is ridiculous. Police officers need the trust of the people in order to legitimize their work, as so well explained at our professional development seminar. What message does it send to marginalized communities that Nazi supporters, that is to say Nazis, are rehired by Portland police? Their behavior outside of work demonstrates their morality. Being a Nazi or a member of a white supremacist group or a militia group or any other domestic terrorism group should violate moral conduct clauses as much as being caught drunk driving or committing domestic abuse. It is mind-boggling that you might believe that somebody would be a Nazi on their off time and then treat minorities fairly on the clock. That's not how people work. Cruelty and hate do not have on-off buttons in the human brain that are activated when you clock in and out of work. I don't know where you draw your lines for decent behavior, but my line is somewhere before Nazi. Another instance I want to give as an example involves the case Martin v. Boise in December 2019. This was the case about the right of unhoused individuals that did not result in a Supreme Court decision, but instead they allowed the lower court's decision to stand. I had heard about this case from the news and also from some podcasts that I listened to. On those podcasts, some lawyers and other legal experts had been interviewed, so my understanding was that if SCOTUS decided to let the lower ruling stand, then how Portland Police deals with Portland's unhoused population would remain unchanged. It would only really affect other agencies. I was on shift when Portland Police sent out an email stating that SCOTUS had announced that they were letting the lower ruling stand, as I had expected. I filed it away and continued with my work, thinking it no big deal. Suddenly, around me, all erupted into chaos and horror, and Jason and Fisher were the leaders of it. The outrage that my coworkers expressed at that email was immediate, extreme, and could be heard from one end of the office to the other. They truly seemed to expect the end of all civilization to result from this decision. After some time, several people actually admitted that they had not read the decision, did not actually know what the case was really about, and did not truly know how it would affect Portland Police, but they were still outraged nonetheless. Everyone seemed to agree that this was still a logical reaction. I remember sitting at my desk and wondering what planet I had been transported to, because this could not possibly be Earth logic that they were using. When I spoke to Sue about my issue with Fisher not speaking to me, I also mentioned this incident as an example of some of my concerns about other comments that Fisher had made that made me uncomfortable. That Fisher was someone who had essentially stoked the flames during the moment of outrage that seemed to consume the office. However, Jason was also very instrumental in this, and despite him being newer to records by many years, sometimes Fisher defers to him in ways that I do not understand. Stephanie is another person who, over time, revealed problematic behavior that though I do not consider her to be anywhere near the level of Jason or Fisher. She is perhaps an annoyance more than a problem. She has an unfortunate habit of butting in conversation that she has not been invited into and only half hearing the topic or the direction of the conversation. I recall one colleague during quarantine when she was being assigned ones and twos. I was at LEDs and another colleague was at Teletype. Teletype was trying to enter a missing person who had several tattoos, and they and I were discussing the proper code for one of the tattoos. I was certain there had to be one of the location on the person's body, but Teletype wasn't finding it in the list. Stephanie suddenly butted in the conversation, clearly not having listened, and started going on a long diatribe about how, especially in winter, we don't have to include every tattoo, just the most visible ones. This was not the point of the discussion. There was enough space to include each tattoo with ease in the miscellaneous and in the supplemental list. We had simply missed which code was the proper one. This, unfortunately, was a common type of experience with Stephanie when she sat near the pod. I don't know if she's socially isolated and desperate for conversation, or if she truly feels that she's contributing, but it is a frequent distraction and unhelpful. If this were the only issue, I would not mention it. However, it seems that every time Stephanie comes across the word houseless to describe the residency of an individual who traditionally might be called transient, she has an outsized reaction to it. I was forced to listen to her complain about this word so many times that I lost count. And it's never just an offhand comment, but something she wants to expound on at length. She is deeply offended about it because, as she puts it, she doesn't own a house. As if I thought I could make a difference by saying something, I would have, as my master's degree is in linguistics. So change in language is actually something I know about. But I doubt she would have listened to a word I had to say, just as Marty had acted like I was so terrible for explaining how normal and understandable that Valeri might go by Larry. Like so many of my coworkers, she also seemed incredibly uninformed. Recently, during quarantine, she complained about people being mad at Donald Trump in connection to coronavirus. What is he supposed to do? I remember her saying. He's just one man. By this point, it was well known that Mr. Trump had been informed by his advisors that coronavirus was coming far in advance, and he chose to do nothing, that he refused to use his powers as president to increase production of PPE and other needed supplies before the crisis hit. For example, through the Defense Production Act, which could have been used very early but was not until late March. And he was promoting dangerous pseudoscience and ineffective medication for inexplicable reasons. There are limits to the powers of the president, but to claim he is powerless is nonsense. Additionally, the president sets the tone for his party and for the nation as a whole. The tone that this president has set is absolutely reprehensible, and it reverberates throughout records. In addition, I want to share an observation from during the first weekend of the protests. You saw Stephanie one of those evenings when you brought in the crock pot with soup. She instantly took control of the conversation, leaving the rest of us with no real opportunity to say anything, as she so often does. We've learned there's no use in trying. Perhaps you noticed how much gusto there was in her tone of voice and her words in describing how the officers were treating the protesters. It made me sick to my stomach. What also made me sick to my stomach was how, at other moments, she would go to the windows and comment on what the officers and protesters were doing, like it was a sporting event and the officers were the righteous home team, or like the officers were herding dogs, rounding up unruly livestock. She truly seemed to enjoy it. She's not the only one. These sorts of attitudes disgust me. I wanted very much to get along with Patty, but we clashed in terms of personality from the start. I think she means well most of the time, but the results vary considerably. She has a tendency to jump to conclusions before you finish giving all the information, and to not really listen in general. My most obvious example comes from quarantine. Lucy had called me when we were getting things started with taking laptops home, and she had asked me what kind of schedule I preferred. We discussed it a bit, and in the end I told her I didn't particularly care, that I hadn't had enough time to think about it, and we'll see what happens. Some days later, Patty was very upset at the fact that some of us, myself included, were assigned a schedule of 1 to 2 days at work, 1 to 2 days at home, and then somehow bring the laptop back to work. After some thinking and discussion, I agreed that this was not the wisest plan, as yes, it did increase opportunities for exposure to coronavirus, and some people were coming from an unreasonable distance. Becca, coming all the way in from Hubbard, was a particularly good example of how silly it was. I was only coming about 20 minutes by bus, and I had an errand I could run on the way home, so I might as well make the outing. But considering it was a brand new program, I was not angry or upset. I agreed in the future I would prefer a day at work, 1 to 2 days at home with the laptop, a day at work, bringing the laptop back that day, what one might call a bracketed schedule. The co-workers in the pod agreed in as much as they agreed to anything. John Esch was very much opposed to taking the laptop home at all, as I recall. Before long, Patty called Sue and told her how upset I was at being forced to bring back the laptop that 5th day, and other things that were quite honestly the exact opposite of what I and the others had said. This was not the first mistake. This was not the first time that Patty had misquoted me in such a blatant way, and I knew that telling her she was wrong or mistaken would only make the situation worse. So I got back to work and kept my head down. A few days later, I got a call from Lucy wanting to know why I had told her one thing and told Patty something completely different. Luckily, I think Lucy understood when I explained what had happened. I know that other people have taken concerns about Patty's jumps to conclusions and misunderstandings to Sue, so I'm certain I was not alone. There are some people in records And there have been good moments in records. I don't want you to think that records is a lost cause. It needs a lot of work and will probably need a lot of personnel turnover because some people will refuse to comply with basic human decency. Opportunities to improve the standard operating procedure and create a proper knowledge bank, which will be necessary if people quit, are fired, or if Portland Police is disbanded or reformed in some way that causes massive upheaval, have been squandered in favor of introducing the AV project, letting confusion reign regarding new policies and procedures, i.e. regarding the tow election forms, and letting people waste time gossiping instead of getting work done. Coworker 3 has experience with knowledge banks from her previous work, if you choose to take up that idea. I could have been someone to help with a project like that with my linguistics background. It's unfortunately too late for that. A few general comments on the attitude in records. There is so much hatred, disgust, dismissal, and disdain for the city of Portland and the citizens of Portland that I am continually confused as to why most of these people work here. Why would you want to work for the city of Portland if you do not like the city of Portland? This is one of the sources of the toxicity in the office that no one seems willing to address. I love Portland, despite its flaws. I've always wanted to live in Portland. It was painful to hear how frequently and openly my coworkers talked about it like it's some kind of living trash heap with no redeeming qualities. Part of the problem is the fact that so many live outside of the city. I was shocked when I heard what some were driving an hour each direction, which represents ridiculous distances for the wages we're earning. As soon as I could afford to move into the city, I did. It was a crappy apartment, but at least I was a member of the community I was serving. Part of being a civil servant, in my thinking, is being part of the civitas that you are serving. Living in it, if at all possible, and if not, then somehow being part of the cultural ecosystem or supporting that culture. Certainly you should be sympathetic to the mores of the people who live and work in it. This is not unique to records, but instead a problem with all employees within the police bureau. Most should be members of the community. The entitlement towards having a job with the city when you don't like the city will always puzzle me. I've mentioned a lack of empathy as characteristic of individuals, but it's also a general problem. On numerous occasions, people commented on how kind and gentle I was with people on the phone and sometimes at the front desk downstairs. I'm still confused as to why this should be so shocking, as instead of the brusque, cruel, or unhelpful ways others are towards callers should be the thing that is shocking. There are so many calls I can remember where the caller was shocked when they asked if I was the tow company or the police, and I said, the police. One woman just a few weeks ago said, but you've been so considerate. How can you be the police? On another very memorable call about a year ago, a man asked if his car had been towed. When I ran the plate and discovered it had been reported stolen earlier in the month, I asked him about that. He told me that yes, he had reported it stolen but wanted to check. I explained that he didn't need to do that because if it was towed in Portland, we would see it and let him know. I took a few minutes and explained the system a bit. He told me that he had been calling every day for 2 weeks, and that I was the first person who had told him that he didn't need to call every day to check, took the time to listen to him and his concerns, and took the time to explain how things worked. These are just a few examples. It costs us almost nothing to be kind, considerate, and helpful to members of the public. And that small effort reaps infinite rewards in terms of public trust and positive attitude towards the police bureau. There's also a depressingly high number of people who have mentioned having majored in psychology in college, but clearly have no idea what mental illness is. Mental illness is just that, an illness. It is not a moral failing. The concurrent shaming of people who take medication on a daily basis is a level of cognitive dissonance that I am not prepared nor qualified to address, as I am certain it would take a PhD in psychology to unravel that mess. Addiction is an illness as well and emerges as a result of previous trauma. Trauma takes many forms, and Portland Police Records is not the judge of what counts as trauma. Homelessness is also not a moral failing on the part of those who are homeless. It is a moral failing on the part of society. Being service resistant is the result of repeated failures of those services, unreasonable waiting periods, and new traumas. This should not be difficult to understand. There is also a very strong attitude of superiority, that members of the public are stupid, that they bring their problems onto themselves, and that they should always know better. This is ridiculous. No one can know everything, and there is always a moment when you learn something for the first time. Before I started this job, I knew absolutely nothing about car ownership and next to nothing about guns, despite growing up in a house with both. They simply weren't things that I was in the right place at the right time to learn something about, or had an interest to learn about, or a need to learn about. If I had tried to buy a car off of Craigslist without the assistance of someone more knowledgeable, I very easily could have fallen into some of the traps that members of the public do, and ended up with a stolen car without realizing it. People make mistakes, and part of being human is making those mistakes and learning from them. Why is it that people in records get angry at officers for not doing things that are actually parts of their job, such as calling in missing persons, removing plates from recovered stolen vehicles, checking VINs on stolen cars, writing reports to go along with property receipts, and actually writing the correct case numbers on property receipts, and then make excuses for officers that otherwise act like their statements are always absolute truth, despite being flawed human beings like the rest of us? And yet members of the public who have no formal training are supposed to be perfect in every way. This is ludicrous. My perspective has always been that when members of the public call in, it is because they have a problem that they cannot solve on their own, and they're hoping that someone with more knowledge and training can assist them. We were those people with training and knowledge, and therefore it is both our duty as employees working our scheduled hours and our moral duty as civil servants to address them. Who are we serving if not the members of the public who call with questions? The police do not exist only for rich, well-educated white Republicans or for white supremacists who play nice to get a permit before their hate rally. They are supposed to protect and serve everyone. Anyone who cannot understand that and cannot understand that their terrible and unprofessional behavior at work reflects poorly on the city of Portland should not be working for the city of Portland. There are some other general patterns of behavior that I don't want to go into detail as this is already so long, but I want to make sure are mentioned. Specialists openly complain about other specialists to each other, and sometimes to coordinators on the floor where anyone can hear. Coordinators complain to each other, and sometimes to specialists about other coordinators, and sometimes even specialists on the floor where everyone can hear. People have spent their extra 2 hours, be it 2 hours that create their 10-hour standard day or overtime, gossiping and complaining. It's not just the individuals I've named above, but those are the most notable ones. There is a strong assumption that everyone is conservative in their politics, voted for Donald Trump, and disagrees with every protest. People get upset at the mere presence of pronouns in people's email signatures. I cannot emphasize enough how traumatic it would be to be trans or non-binary in records. Many people who are not neurotypical could easily succeed at the tasks in records, but attitudes in records would drive them away. Being PC, politically correct, is dismissed as oversensitive liberalism instead of what it really is. Just being polite and respectful. Some people are using DMV photos to determine the race or ethnicity of individuals named on reports, which is not appropriate. On one occasion, someone said that a woman who was definitely white and couldn't possibly be Native American based on the photo. This was said in front of coworker 4, who, based on her DMV photo, would probably be described in the same way, but most definitely identifies herself as Native American. I don't know if coworker 4 heard it because of her disability, but I did. It's not our jobs to determine other people's intimate identities. Our job is only to connect names and dates of birth. If their race is left unknown, that is none of our business. Now, I want to mention a few incidents that were shared with me by coworkers. I wish to be clear, I cannot substantiate these as I did not witness them myself, but I trust the people that shared them with me. Most of us eventually heard something about how coworker 4 was treated by coworkers on day shift. Bullying a coworker for disability is unacceptable, and I'm mystified by the fact that no one was fired. Perhaps some kind of disciplinary action was taken that we're not privy to. Certainly things happen regarding discipline which remains a mystery to everyone else. It's been whispered to me that Joe Felix and Fisher had to visit internal affairs on numerous occasions, but they remain employed. In the right environment and with the right equipment, Coworker 4 can do almost everything required. That is to say, when proper accommodations are made as the law requires. Portland Police should consider itself lucky that she did not quit on the spot and hire a lawyer. Records should be a place where any member of the public could possibly become an employee, not just those who are abled, white, cisgender, straight, Christian, and Republican. A coworker shared with me that some people in the pod were hanging up on members of the public who asked for translators. The coworker called out Joe, Alexis, and Bethany specifically. This is also unacceptable. We have a translation service available. We are a public service available to all, and discriminating against people due to national origin is not to be tolerated. I have personally overheard them rant about how people should just learn English if they're going to live here. Ma'am, I taught English as a foreign and second language. English is a ridiculous language to learn. I lived in another country for 4.5 years and barely got on what I learned of that language, let alone what I would have needed to know to ask if my car had been towed. My great-grandparents on my father's side were all immigrants, and they barely spoke a word in English after decades in this country. As someone who can speak to this in something of an expert capacity with a master's degree in linguistics, it is normal to not speak much of the new language until the second generation, unless it is absolutely necessary for work or some other purpose. We are babied by the rest of the world by being exposed to extremely well-educated leaders and celebrities who were required to learn English from an early age, which is not the case of the average immigrant calling to find out where their car disappeared to. I challenge those co-workers to live abroad and see how well they do. Another incident shared with me comes from the first week of June 2020. A co-worker told me that they overheard people complaining about the protest because of course there are nothing but complaints. During the conversation, Joe Felix reportedly advocated for officers to run over protesters with their cars to solve the problem. Ma'am, I hope I do not have to remind you that first, this would be assault of some sort and potentially homicide. And secondly, this evokes the 2017 murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville by a neo-Nazi. Not only that, but since that statement was reported to me, there have been numerous attempts and some successes to do so across the nation. Later in June, someone did in fact hit several people with a car in Portland during a march and sent 3 people to the hospital. The same coworker who relayed this incident to me also said that it was a good thing I wasn't coming into work, because enough terrible things have been said about me by people like Joe, Alexis, Amelia, who had never struck me as one of the problematic ones, and Fisher, with enough comments that could have been construed as threats that I could have had a very easy lawsuit to win. I have never been unkind or unfriendly to any of these people, and have always done my best to be professional and helpful when I worked with them. My email was the first time I ever truly expressed myself in 3.5 years working in records. A few words about leadership in records to tie this all together. When I started working in records, I had absolutely no one to turn to because the hierarchy of leadership was hidden from me, to the point that when the captain who had your job at the time retired, I did not recognize his name at all on the posters that went up. I did not know who he was or that he even existed. I met Tammy briefly my first day at the very end, after I was already stunned into silence by Mel's unprofessional commentary, and very much off balance by being on night shift for the first time in my life. But I did not really comprehend who she was or what her relationship to records was, other than that she was somehow connected to management. At some point I had enough emails from her, or had overheard enough comments, that I figured out I should ask her about the harassment seminar. By the time Wendy Steinbraun arrived to be the new manager, I had no hope and no trust that anyone in records would take my concerns seriously. For a brief moment, however, Wendy did give me hope. She made an effort to come around to all the shifts to talk to everyone and at least match names to faces. She was personable, and she talked about making changes. She introduced surveys to see where the problems might be and get feedback. There were discussions led by Elle Weatheroy from one of the city offices. Diversity. Wendy made a serious effort to get me to come and speak with her, and I told Elle and group after that group discussion that I had witnessed some despicable things, and I came so close to actually speaking to her. Fear of retaliation held me back until it was too late, and she moved on to a new job, and you came in as her replacement. I was not the only one who said that terrible things were going on. Coworker 5 from Public Records was at that discussion, and she also mentioned having to hear a lot of unprofessional comments. I don't know if anyone ever followed up with her about it. I don't remember what other people said, but she was the only one whose comments were in the same vein as mine. I think you have a lot of potential, and I think you mean well. I also think there's a lot of room for improvement. People want and need to see you during shifts more and get to know you, not just see you briefly at important announcements at roll call. You need to exist for all shifts, not just day shift, even if only once in a while, to see what things are really like, how people are on their best behavior, what the workload is really like. Some people are concerned about what it might mean that some co-workers have had one-on-one meetings with you, but they have not. We were confused about why we had to set up Zoom accounts. There was really no explanation about why it was relevant for records. Most people want you to put an end to the AV project, at least temporarily. There just isn't time or manpower to deal with it, and people are still misfiling things, which could lead to things being destroyed that shouldn't be destroyed. We've talked about wanting you to lay down the law, as it were, with the training coordinators and tell them to first, stop acting like middle schoolers with their petty feuds among themselves and start acting like adults. Second, train everyone the same way so that there's consistency across the shifts and trainers. And third, stop acting like the day shift is some special case where the rules do not apply. I've worked on all 3 shifts. Day shift also needs to stop making so many excuses about passing on tons of work when they're normally staffed. We also need to get rid of the auto records handle and have a different system. It is so frequently ignored that I often find reports on it that have been sent there 24 hours earlier and never dealt with, meaning that 3 shifts had ignored it. Some requested corrections that were even wrong or so minor as to be irrelevant. A coworker on day shift reports that management on day shift during quarantine is a disaster. For example, they frequently do not receive their schedules, and when they have called Lisa to ask about it, they're directed to call another coworker instead of Lisa just emailing it to them or telling them which days they're assigned. This is the kind of nonsense you would expect for a minimum wage job in retail or fast food. Afternoon shift does not have this problem to my knowledge. I received the schedule emailed to both home and work email without problems. My only issue was a snafu with the home phone number because something had not been updated. This coworker characterized management and records during quarantine and the protests as forgetting that they actually manage people, or that they manage actual people. I concur with this coworker. There's been very little care given to the fact that we are actually human beings and not just workers. Due to issues with taking vacation time, no one can self-isolate for 2 weeks so that they can visit family members that they do not live with. As I was writing most of this, I was at my parents' house for the first time since the first week of March. I used to visit at least every 2 weeks. No one asked if we needed any kind of special accommodation or assistance. Impersonal emails sent to all city employees do not count. No one really asked how we were handling things or how we were doing in general. And I don't think anyone considered that being cut off from family and friends by being required to still come to work would be a heavy burden that would be eased by pairing us up with coworkers that we were particularly friendly with. I feel lucky that the vast majority of my shifts during quarantine were with people I either got on well with or could work with without too much noise. I appreciate the attempt to check people's temperatures, but the thermometer sometimes records my temperature as almost 94 or 95 degrees, which is not a reasonable number. I also appreciate the provision of cleaning supplies, but we were given very little instruction on how to use the spray cleaner, which was in an unlabeled bottle. We were not given any material safety information about it. We were not told exactly or what exactly it was. If someone had needed medical attention due to exposure from it, we would have been unable to inform medical personnel what they were dealing with. We were told to leave it on the desks for about 5 minutes. But anyone who has ever worked in the pod knows that this is a ridiculous expectation because the chances of the phone not ringing or something not coming off the printer in that first 5 minutes of the shift are very low. The one time I used the spray, I got a terrible migraine. I brought in my own unscented wipes, which Mike Boyer deemed sufficient, and never touched the spray again. When the protests started, there was no consideration of the additional stress that this placed on us. We should have relocated on Saturday and remained in that new location indefinitely, given the fact that there was a fire on Friday. Surely there was some kind of emergency plan in case of an earthquake destroying the Justice Center, which I am told is supposed to flatten the top floors down through the 11th floor in the event of a major earthquake. And that plan could have been put immediately into action. I was jumping at loud noises for days after hearing so many explosions for 3 days in a row working at the Justice Center. And I do not blame the protesters at all for that. I blame Portland police and their apparent refusal to engage in any type of de-escalation or solidarity tactics. I am still angry that management looked at the schedule on Sunday, saw that coworker 6 was the recall person, and decided that recalling someone who is heavily pregnant into work in the midst of all that was going on was the right thing to do, rather than making the executive decision to scrap the recall designation and call someone else or leave the position unmanned. It was her 4th day in a row. I had thought about calling in sick that day and did not, in hopes of sparing coworker 6 the necessity of coming in, because I knew she was the recall person. But it was in vain because someone else called in, someone that coworker 6 could not possibly replace because they're not intake trained and she was replacing the 1s and 2s person. That night we were evacuated for reasons still not explained to me. When we arrived at North Precinct, Marty Meyer took over, and I remember her saying, with extreme annoyance in her voice, "I am so tired of this," referring to the protests. Personally, I think our fellow citizens are more tired of being targeted for simply being black, or Hispanic, or indigenous, or disabled, or queer in America. On Monday, instead of checking in with me after 3 days of intense stress and an emergency evacuation, I got reprimanded by Lucy for not calling in sick. Ma'am, my body had given out. I was sicker with a migraine than I had been in years. I could barely walk. Hours later, when the medication kicked in, I realized that the phone number she'd given in her voicemail was her desk phone at the Justice Center, meaning that Records was back at the Justice Center. I had no idea. No one had sent an email or left a voicemail informing me that we had already gone back to the Justice Center that Monday. So if I had tried to call in sick, I would have tried to call North Precinct, and they probably would have been very confused. There was zero communication during that week. I kept waiting for additional information, and instead I just kept seeing Portland police officers throw temper tantrums. No one checked in with me until I sent the email. And then you all panicked. For your information, Angie Nelson from EAP did call me sometime that weekend after I sent the email. I called her back and left a voicemail on June 7th. As of writing this, I still have no response. Therefore, I feel fairly justified in never reaching out to EAP before. If they do not care now, they did not care before. My email was an act of protest and my patriotic and civic duty to speak out against the horrific behavior of the Portland Police Bureau. I could not be on the streets with the people of the city that I served, but I could speak out. It happened to take the form of satire because that is the direction that my brain took at that moment, and I knew it would catch someone's attention. Protest is one of the most patriotic acts available to citizens. Compared to the grievous bodily harm suffered by protesters at the hands of law enforcement in this city and others, my email and resignation are minor, but they are protest nonetheless. They are my righteous anger and frustration made manifest. Fundamentally, all I wanted was to do my job in peace and help the people of Portland in the process of doing my job. Instead, I experienced all of the above and more. I leave you with these thoughts. I was not the only person who leans left politically in Records. I am not the only person who has felt silenced, who has been afraid of speaking up, or who has witnessed coworkers doing and saying things that would have gotten them automatically fired at any other job. I was simply the person who had had enough and decided to use my voice for once. I do not judge my coworkers for staying. These are difficult times, and this country makes it entirely too difficult to leave a job. But for your sake and theirs, I hope you consider what I have written and take serious actions to make changes in records regarding reporting problems, expectations for behavior, and setting examples of attitude. For me, the job, the actual tasks performed, were almost never a problem. The problem was always the people. At its definition, this is what a toxic work environment is. A workplace where behavior is so out of control in some way that no matter what the tasks might be, former employees cannot recommend it to job searchers. I cannot recommend Portland Police records to anyone, and that is a heavy burden on my heart. It is a good job. The tasks are not difficult. There is a nice variety of tasks. The benefits are good. There's the possibility of a schedule to your liking. If someone asked me about it, I would have to tell them that the culture in records is so toxic that it's not worth it. Even before officers decided to tear gas half of downtown, assault members of the press, and treat protesters like enemy combatants, I would have said it was not worth it. Now, I don't think anyone will bother asking me because I doubt anyone will want to work for Portland Police. I wish you the best in your endeavors, Laura Jensen. All right, I don't know that anyone in her position could have said what she said any more clearly than she did. A couple of things that I do want to mention. When I got this letter, there were no redactions in it. There were some redactions that I did to protect the good apples, the few people there who were not causing all these problems, the people that were victims in as much as Laura was a victim in this. It's not my place to be sharing out their names like that. I have had a brief brush with the name Elle Weatherroy before. At the time that she was referenced in this letter, my understanding is she was the equity coordinator for the Portland Police Bureau. I had tried to reach out to her because of concerns that I had dealing with protests that I was trying to address. And by the time I tried to reach out, she had already left the Bureau, and at the time, I had no indication that the position had been replaced. I'm sure there's more that I wanted to say, but just going through this, and this is the fourth time I've read this letter, and it's still hitting hard. I want to thank people that have helped convince me to continue doing this work, doing these requests. If people want to support in a financial way, we do have Cash App and Venmo. They're both Raindrop Works PX. And while I don't have a lot of operating expenses right now, that does mean that I can help funnel money towards being able to get access to more records. Not everything is provided by government agencies to me free, like this document was. But honestly, more worried about supporting people that are marginalized in the community, that need help in their day-to-day lives. We know that the police won't help them. Obviously, even the employees don't want to help them. And just like the idea that good cops get pushed out of law enforcement, it's not just the cops. It's anyone who tries to do better in the system but can't. I also want to thank RevNat. I'm not sure that I would have been able to do this if I hadn't known beforehand that I'd be able to get a bit buzzed in the process. Hopefully next time I'm around, I'm hoping to continue improving the work that I'm doing here. And maybe I'll be able to have better productions going forward. But in the meantime, everyone take care and be good to each other. And even though it seems hard, keep fighting for what's right. This is Raindrop Works signing off.